On the morning of the 10th of June, 1944, 4 days after the initial D-Day invasion of Normandy, Second Lieutenant Frances Slanger of the 45th Field Hospital, United States Army Nurse Corps, waded ashore at a French beach. She was 31 years old, stood barely 4 feet 10 inches tall, and almost drowned when she stepped off the landing craft because she couldn't touch bottom in the chest-deep water. Around her, the evidence of battle remained fresh. Within hours of landing, she and her fellow nurses had established a functioning surgical unit, treating soldiers whose wounds testified to the brutal combat of the previous 4 days. What Frances and thousands of women like her would endure over the coming months would challenge every assumption about women's roles in warfare, and their story reveals a level of courage and sacrifice that has only recently begun to receive proper recognition. The United States Army Nurse Corps had been established on the 2nd of February, 1901, opening the door for women in the military for the first time. The Navy Nurse Corps followed in 1908. But it wasn't until the Second World War that nurses were deployed in large numbers to forward areas close to actual combat operations. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, there were fewer than 1,000 nurses in the Army Nurse Corps and just over 800 in the Navy Nurse Corps. 82 Army nurses were stationed at 3 medical facilities in Hawaii that morning and worked through the chaos as hundreds of casualties poured in, suffering from severe burns, shrapnel wounds, and shock. The blood-spattered entrance stairs at Tripler Army Hospital led to hallways where wounded men lay on the floor awaiting surgery. By the end of the war in 1945, more than 59,000 women had served in the Army Nurse Corps, and approximately 11,000 in the Navy Nurse Corps. These weren't the starched uniform nurses of peacetime hospitals. These were women who lived in tents, worked in mud, performed surgery under artillery fire, and died alongside the soldiers they were trying to save. Lieutenant Colonel Julia Flicka, the superintendent of the Army Nurse Corps from 1937 to 1943, understood something that many military planners initially resisted. Wounded soldiers had the best chance of survival if they received expert surgical care within the first few hours of injury. Every minute of delay increased the mortality rate dramatically. The problem was that to provide that immediate care, medical personnel had to be positioned in extraordinarily dangerous locations, well within range of enemy artillery and sometimes even small arms fire. The military establishment hesitated to place women in such peril. Flicka's response was pragmatic and unwavering. The nurses volunteered. They understood the risks, and soldiers were dying who didn't have to die. The mathematics of battlefield medicine demanded that skilled nurses work as close to the fighting as physically possible. The 45th Field Hospital established itself in Normandy in the days following the invasion. The hospital consisted of large squad tents arranged in rows, with surgical tents, pre-operative areas, post-operative wards, and triage stations. There was no running water initially, no electricity except what could be generated by small portable units, and certainly no heat. The nurses worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, sometimes longer when casualties were heavy. During the first week after D-Day, they performed hundreds of surgical procedures in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in any civilian facility. The surgical teams operated by flashlight when generators failed. They boiled instruments in water heated over small fires. They used plasma and whole blood that had been shipped across the English Channel, hoping it hadn't spoiled in transit. Lieutenant Slanger quickly gained recognition for her ability to improvise under pressure. When wounded soldiers couldn't lift their heads to drink water, she fashioned water bottles from intravenous bottles and rubber tubing. If a soldier wanted the bullet or shrapnel fragment that had wounded him as a souvenir, she retrieved it and gave it to him. And when a frightened young man called out for his mother in the night, she sat beside him and sang until he fell asleep. As the 45th Field Hospital moved with the advancing Allied forces, through France and into Belgium, the nurses experienced the full reality of forward combat medicine. By October 1944, the unit had positioned itself near the Belgian town of Elsenborn, approximately 20 miles from the German border. The area had been relatively quiet for several days. On the evening of the 21st of October 1944, Lieutenant Slanger couldn't sleep. It was 0200 hours, and she lay in her tent, listening to the steady breathing of the 3 other nurses sleeping nearby. The fire in their small stove had burned down to coals. Rain beat against the canvas with torrential force. She got up quietly, fed wood and then coal into the stove until she had a roaring fire and began to write. She wrote a letter to Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The letter expressed her admiration for the courage of the soldiers she had treated, men who apologized for bleeding on her uniform, who thanked her even as they lay dying. She marveled at their resilience and their humanity in the midst of such horror. She finished the letter as dawn approached and mailed it that morning. Hours later, on the night of the 21st of October, 1944, German artillery began shelling the 45th Field Hospital. For 45 minutes, shells rained down on the compound. A piece of shrapnel struck Lieutenant Frances Slanger in the chest. She died within minutes. Even as she lay dying, witnesses reported, she expressed concern for the other wounded around her and asked if they were being cared for. She was the first American nurse to be killed by direct enemy action in Europe after the D-Day invasion. When Slanger's letter arrived at Stars and Stripes, the editors were so moved that they published it as a guest editorial without knowing she had been killed. When it appeared in print, soldiers across Europe began writing letters to her, thanking her for her words, telling her that she had restored some of their faith in humanity amid the devastation of war. A week later, the newspaper reported that Lieutenant Slanger had been killed the night she wrote the letter. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of soldiers wrote demanding that her memory be honored, that her sacrifice be recognized, that her name never be forgotten. In June 1945, the United States Army commissioned a hospital ship and named it the USAHS Frances Y. Slanger. Initially buried in a military cemetery in France beneath a Star of David, her remains were returned to the United States in 1947 and reinterred at the Independent Pride of Boston Cemetery in Roxbury, Massachusetts. The mayor of Boston was among the thousands who attended the ceremony. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, American nurses faced an entirely different nightmare. When Japanese forces attacked the Philippines in December 1941, 88 Army nurses were stationed at various medical facilities around Manila, along with 11 Navy nurses. First Lieutenant Ann Bernatitis of the Navy Nurse Corps was among those stationed at the Naval Hospital in Cavite when Japanese bombers struck on the 10th of December 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. The hospital was hit by multiple bombs in a raid lasting less than 30 minutes. Bernatitis and her fellow nurses worked through the attack, moving patients to underground shelters, treating burns and traumatic injuries while the building collapsed around them. She later described the scene as hell brought to life. Fires raged. Ammunition stored nearby cooked off in the heat. The smell of burning flesh was overwhelming. After Cavite was evacuated, Bernatitis and most of the Army nurses retreated first to Bataan and eventually to the island fortress of Corregidor. On Corregidor, the nurses established a hospital facility deep within the Malinta Tunnel complex, carved 150 feet beneath solid rock. The main tunnel measured 1,400 feet long and 30 feet wide, with 24 lateral tunnels branching off on each side. 13 of these laterals were converted into hospital wards. The nurses worked in near total darkness with only dim electric lights powered by a generator that frequently failed. The air was thick with humidity and the stench of infected wounds. Over 1,000 wounded soldiers were eventually crammed into spaces designed to hold perhaps 200. The temperature inside the tunnels hovered around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, with nearly 100% humidity. Nurses wore the same uniforms for weeks, because there was no way to wash and dry them properly. Captain Maud Davison, the 57-year-old chief nurse who had served in the Army Nurse Corps since World War I, organized the nurses into rotating shifts and maintained strict discipline regarding sanitation and infection control, despite the impossible conditions. Just prior to the fall of Bataan, on the 9th of April 1942, General Jonathan Wainwright ordered the nurses to retreat from their jungle field hospitals to Corregidor. The order devastated them. Their duty was to care for their patients, not abandon them. According to diaries and later interviews, they felt like traitors leaving behind the soldiers in their care. None of them ever forgot the eyes of their patients as they departed. 2 days later, approximately 60,000 Timern, 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war began the notorious Bataan Death March to Camp O'Donnell, where physical abuse, starvation, and wholesale murder awaited them. As Corregidor itself came under increasingly heavy bombardment and Japanese invasion appeared imminent, Captain Davison was ordered to select nurses for evacuation. On the 29th of April, 20 nurses left the island on 2 Navy flying boats. Only one plane reached Australia safely. The second was forced down on Mindanao Lake, and all aboard were captured by the Japanese. On the 3rd of May, a submarine evacuated 10 Army nurses, 1 Navy nurse, and several civilians to safety. When Corregidor surrendered to Japanese forces under General Masaharu Homma on the 6th of May, 1942, 55 Army nurses remained at the Malinta Tunnel Hospital. They were taken prisoner. Eventually, all 66 Army nurses captured in the Philippines were transferred to Santo Tomas Internment Camp in Manila, a facility established on the campus of the University of Santo Tomas. There, they joined the 11 Navy nurses who had been captured when Manila fell, bringing the total number of American military nurses held as prisoners of war to 77. They would remain in Japanese captivity for 3 years. Under the leadership of Captain Maud Davison and Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, age 47, who served as second in command, the nurses maintained their identity and discipline throughout their imprisonment. They established a hospital within the camp called Santa Catalina Hospital and organized rotating 4-hour nursing shifts that gave them purpose and structure. They treated over 3,700 other internees for accidents, disease, and the effects of starvation. The camp eventually held more than 6,000 prisoners living in desperately overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The nurses helped organize public health campaigns to stem epidemics. As the war progressed and conditions deteriorated, daily rations were cut to only 1 cup of rice twice a day. The nurses resorted to eating weeds, roots, flowers, and slugs to survive. By January 1945, the death rate in Santo Tomas had risen to 7 times that of normal civilian life. What they didn't know was that American forces were rapidly approaching. On the 3rd of February 1945, a flying column of the 1st Cavalry Division liberated Santo Tomas Internment Camp. All 77 nurses who had entered the camp 3 years earlier walked out alive, though they were sick, weak, and had lost an average of 30% of their body weight. Captain Maud Davison, who normally weighed 135 pounds, had dropped to 80 pounds and required immediate hospitalization. This achievement was unprecedented. There were 77 American military nurses who became prisoners of war, and 77 who survived until liberation. No other group of female prisoners of war in World War II could make that claim. The nurses credited their survival to their training, their discipline, and their commitment to caring for others, even when they themselves were starving. After liberation, each nurse was promoted and awarded the Bronze Star for valor. Captain Anne Bernatitis, who had escaped Corregidor on the submarine and reached Australia, became the only Navy nurse in World War II to be awarded the Legion of Merit. Captain Maud Davison was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 2001, recognizing her leadership in keeping the nurses alive through 3 years of brutal captivity. Back in Europe, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in 1945, nurses increasingly dealt with the aftermath of Nazi atrocities. On the 29th of April 1945, American forces, including elements of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions, liberated the Dachau concentration camp near Munich. Medical personnel, including Army nurses from the 116th Evacuation Hospital and other nearby units, immediately established emergency medical stations to treat survivors. The camp held approximately 32,000 people, many weighing less than 70 pounds, suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and advanced starvation. Nurses who had treated every form of combat wound imaginable found themselves confronting a different kind of horror. These were people who had endured months or years of deliberate, systematic cruelty. Some survivors died even after receiving food and water because their bodies could no longer process nutrition. The nurses worked for days with almost no rest, setting up rehydration stations, administering emergency medications, and trying desperately to save as many as possible. Many nurses later said that treating Dachau survivors was the most difficult experience of their entire military service, more challenging emotionally than any combat casualties they had encountered. The statistics compiled at war's end tell a story of extraordinary service and sacrifice. During World War II, American military nurses treated millions of wounded soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen in every theater of combat. The mortality rate among American wounded who reached medical facilities was approximately 4%, the lowest in any major war up to that time. This achievement was due directly to the skill and dedication of nurses working in forward positions, often under fire. Of the approximately 70,000 American military nurses who served in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps combined, 201 died during the war from all causes, including illness and accidents. 16 were killed by direct enemy action. The deadliest single incident occurred on the 28th of April 1945, when a Japanese kamikaze aircraft struck the hospital ship USS Comfort off Okinawa. The attack killed 6 Army nurses, along with medical officers, enlisted men, and patients. Dozens of nurses were wounded in various incidents throughout the war. The Army Nurse Corps was awarded more than 1,600 military decorations, including Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, Legion of Merit medals, and Purple Hearts. Yet far more acts of courage went unrecognized simply because the military establishment still struggled with acknowledging women as combat veterans. In the Pacific, nurses served under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The climate itself was an enemy. Nurses in Burma treated soldiers fighting in the 14th Army's campaign against Japanese forces while battling malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers themselves. In the Philippines, nurses landed with assault forces on Leyte Island in October 1944 and came under regular Japanese air attack. Throughout the island-hopping campaign, nurses worked in field hospitals that were sometimes positioned less than 10 miles from active combat. They treated not only combat wounds, but the devastating effects of tropical diseases that incapacitated entire units. The flight nurse program, though considered experimental for most of the war, proved highly successful. Flight nurses used the same transport aircraft that carried paratroopers to evacuate wounded soldiers from frontline field hospitals to better equipped facilities in rear areas. They saved thousands of lives, though the work carried additional risks. These nurses faced the dangers of enemy fighters, mechanical failures, and weather conditions while caring for critically wounded patients at altitude. The Soviet Union mobilized women in medical roles to a degree unmatched by any other combatant nation. Approximately 500,000 Soviet women served in various medical capacities, many positioned directly at the front lines. Senior Lieutenant Valentina Chudnova served as a battalion-level surgeon with the 64th Guards Rifle Division during the Battle of Stalingrad from August 1942 to February 1943. Soviet medical doctrine placed surgeons and nurses in battalion aid stations, often less than 500 yards behind frontline trenches. For 5 months, Chudnova and her medical team occupied a partially collapsed building in the Red October factory district, one of the most fiercely contested areas of the city. They performed emergency surgery in a basement with no heat, intermittent light from oil lamps, and under constant threat from German snipers. The Soviet military awarded Chudnova the Order of the Red Star on the 15th of January 1943. The citation noted that she had personally performed 67 abdominal surgeries in November 1942 alone, with a survival rate exceeding 70% despite the primitive conditions. Her willingness to operate on soldiers whom conventional triage would have classified as beyond saving reflected a philosophy shared by many Soviet medical personnel. If a soldier was conscious and fighting to live, you fought alongside him regardless of the odds. The transition for combat nurses after the war proved difficult in ways that few anticipated. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the military provided no counseling, no debriefing, and no psychological support. Nurses were simply expected to process their experiences privately and move forward. Rates of depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse among nurses who served in combat zones remained elevated for decades, though this was rarely acknowledged or studied. Many nurses never spoke of their experiences, not because of any sworn secrecy, but because they sensed that civilian society couldn't or wouldn't understand what they had witnessed and endured. They had seen humanity at its absolute worst and had responded with humanity at its absolute best. That paradox was difficult to communicate to people who had never faced it. For decades after the war, combat nurses struggled to receive the same veterans' benefits and recognition afforded to men who served in similar dangerous positions. It wasn't until the 1980s that the full scope of their service began to be properly documented and acknowledged. Today, the legacy of World War II nurses is honored at the Army Nurse Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1991. The memorial features a sculpture of a nurse holding a wounded soldier, with the names of nurses killed in action inscribed on surrounding walls. But recognition came late for many who served. Some nurses carried on after the war without any bitterness. Second Lieutenant Ruby Bradley, who survived 3 years as a prisoner of war at Santo Tomas, stayed in the Army and made a career of military nursing, something rare for women at that time. She was promoted to colonel, served in combat in Korea, and retired as the most decorated woman in United States military history. Others found the transition to peacetime more difficult. Some nurses who had survived combat zones and prisoner of war camps struggled with depression and trauma for the rest of their lives, though they rarely discussed it publicly. The women who served as the Angels of Bataan maintained contact with each other for decades, bound by shared experiences that outsiders could never fully understand. They met regularly, supported each other through difficult times, and worked to ensure that their story would not be forgotten. The women who served as combat nurses in World War II established beyond question that courage, skill, and dedication to duty transcend gender. They proved that the defining characteristic of a soldier is not physical strength but moral strength, the capacity to continue functioning under conditions of extreme stress and danger in service of a mission larger than oneself. More than 70,000 women served in the United States Army and Navy Nurse Corps during World War II. Thousands more served in British, Soviet, Canadian, Australian, and other Allied medical units. They saved hundreds of thousands of lives. They endured conditions that broke hardened combat veterans. They performed surgery under artillery fire, treated patients while suffering from disease and starvation themselves, and maintained their professionalism and compassion in situations that defied comprehension. 16 American nurses were killed by direct enemy action. 77 were prisoners of war for 3 years, and all 77 survived. 201 died in service to their country from all causes. Their story is not a footnote to the war. It is central to understanding how the war was fought and won, and it deserves to be remembered not as an inspiring sidebar, but as an essential chapter in the history of modern warfare and the history of women's achievement in the face of extraordinary adversity.